A soldier who gave everything for his country, now sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. When James Callahan, a decorated ex-military officer, was wrongfully convicted and placed on death row, he had only one final request: to say goodbye to his loyal canine German Shepherd, Max. But what happened next will shock you, because when Max was brought to that cold, dark prison cell, something unbelievable happened, something no one expected. Stay with us until the end of this heart-wrenching story. You won't believe the final twist. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single one of our inspiring stories. James Callahan sat in his dimly lit prison cell, staring at the cracks in the concrete wall, as if they held the answers to the nightmare his life had become. Just months ago, he had been a decorated military officer, a man who had served his country with honor, a man who had saved lives. But now he was nothing more than a prisoner on death row, counting down the final hours before his execution. The weight of injustice pressed down on his chest. He had pleaded his case, fought for the truth, but the evidence had been stacked against him. The real criminals were out there, free, while he was locked away, waiting for the end. His only comfort in these final moments was the thought of Max, his canine partner, his best friend, the only soul in this world who had never doubted him. When they had been deployed together, Max had been more than just a dog. He had been James's shadow, his protector, his brother in arms. Through firefights and ambushes, Max had saved his life more times than James could count. They had seen the worst of humanity together, endured things no one else could understand. And now James's heart ached with one final wish: to see Max one last time. The guards had laughed at his request at first. A dying man's last wish was usually a final meal or a message to family. But a dog? They thought it was ridiculous. Still, someone must have taken pity on him because, hours later, a guard unlocked his cell and wordlessly gestured for him to follow. James's chains clinked as he stood, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and walked down the cold, lifeless corridor. His heart pounded with anticipation, each step bringing him closer to the only friend who had never betrayed him. As he stepped into the visiting area, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing tall and proud, was Max. The German Shepherd's ears perked up the second he saw James, and in an instant, all the rigid military training melted away. With a sharp bark, Max pulled against his leash, desperate to reach him. James barely had time to kneel before Max lunged into his arms. The force of it knocked James back slightly, but he didn't care. Max whined, his big paws resting against James's chest, licking his face frantically, as if trying to erase the months they had been apart. Tears burned in James's eyes. He wasn't the kind of man who cried. He had seen too much, been through too much. But as he buried his face into Max's thick fur, inhaling the familiar scent of his partner, he couldn't stop the tear that slipped down his cheek. "I missed you, buddy," James murmured, his voice hoarse. Max let out a low whine, pressing his body as close as he could, as if trying to shield James from whatever was coming next. The guards shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. Even they weren't heartless enough to ruin this moment. James knew this was goodbye. He tried to savor it, tried to memorize every detail. The way Max's tail wagged slightly, the warmth of his breath, the unshakable trust in those deep brown eyes. But then, Max did something strange. He stiffened. His ears twitched, his gaze shifting toward the guard standing by the door. Then, before James could react, Max let out a low, guttural growl. James had seen that look before, in war zones, in ambushes. It was the look Max had when he sensed danger. The hair on James's arm stood up. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Max's body was tense, his muscles coiled like a spring, his growl deepening. James followed his gaze, and noticed the guard near the door shifting slightly, his hand resting on his hip, where his weapon should have been. A chill ran down James's spine. Something was wrong. Before he could react, Max lunged. The room erupted into chaos. The other guards shouted, scrambling as Max tackled the man to the ground, his powerful jaws locking around his wrist. A gun clattered to the floor, spinning across the tiles. James's heart pounded. That guard had a gun. Inside a maximum security prison. Everything snapped into place at once. Someone didn't want James to live long enough to make it to the execution room. This wasn't just an unfair trial. This was a setup, and Max had just saved his life, again. James moved on instinct. His military training kicked in, his body reacting before his mind could process the full extent of what was happening. The guard on the ground struggled, his face twisted in panic as Max's teeth clamped around his wrist. He screamed, trying to shake the canine off, but Max held firm, growling fiercely. The other guards reacted too slowly. One reached for his radio, the other hesitated, caught between following protocol and dealing with the fact that a dog had just exposed something they weren't supposed to see. James lunged for the fallen gun, kicking it across the floor before anyone else could grab it. He wasn't about to give them the chance. The guard on the ground cursed, his free hand reaching toward his boot, but Max was faster. With a sharp tug, he yanked the man's arm forward, knocking him off balance. The knife hidden in the boot clattered to the floor. James's blood ran cold. A knife. A gun. In a highly secured prison. This wasn't incompetence. This was an execution. James snapped his head toward the two standing guards. One of them, the older one, looked stunned, his eyes darting between the scene and the weapon on the floor. The other guard, younger, his face tight with tension, had already drawn his baton, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. James could see it in his face. Fear. Not fear of the situation, fear of being caught. They hadn't expected this to go wrong. James raised his hand slowly, keeping his posture calm, controlled. "You know what's happening here, don't you?" he said, his voice low. Neither guard answered, but the way their eyes flicked toward the surveillance cameras told him everything. James knew how prisons worked. Cameras weren't always monitored in real time. Some places had blind spots, others had corrupt officers who conveniently lost footage. But he also knew that, in rooms like this, everything was supposed to be recorded. "Someone ordered this," James continued, his heart pounding. "Someone high up. This wasn't just a mistake." The older guard took a step back. His hesitation told James one thing. He wasn't in on it. The younger one, though. James turned his attention to him. "What's the plan now?" he asked. "You kill me and blame the dog? Say he went rabid?" The younger guard flinched. Bingo. James's pulse roared in his ears. He didn't have much time. Either someone would come through that door any second, or they'd try to take him out another way. He needed to act. Now. With a sharp command, James snapped his fingers. "Max, stand down." Instantly, Max released the injured guard, backing up to James's side, teeth still bared. The wounded man groaned, clutching his wrist, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and fear. James took a slow step forward. The older guard took another step back. The younger one didn't move, but his grip on the baton tightened. James exhaled sharply. "If you let this happen, you're just as guilty as whoever sent them." The words hit their mark. The older guard looked down, his lips pressing into a thin line. He was thinking, calculating. James had one shot. "You know I didn't do this," James pushed. "They're trying to clean up their mess, and if they're willing to kill a decorated soldier in prison, what makes you think they won't do the same to you when you outlive your usefulness?" The older guard swallowed hard. His gaze flicked to the cameras again. Then he made his choice. Without a word, he reached for his radio and pressed a button. "We have an emergency in visitation. We need immediate backup." The younger guard's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" The older man's jaw was tight. Doing the right thing. James almost couldn't believe it. For the first time since he was locked in this hellhole, someone was finally listening. But it wasn't over yet, because the moment that call went out, whoever was behind this would know their plan had failed, and they wouldn't stop. James had just bought himself a few more minutes, but if he wanted to get out of here alive, he and Max were going to have to fight for it. The moment the emergency call was sent out, James knew there was no turning back. Everything had changed in an instant. Whoever had orchestrated this attack would be scrambling now, trying to figure out how to cover their tracks. But James had been a soldier long enough to know one thing. When a mission fails, the people in charge don't just abandon it. They adapt. And that meant whoever wanted him dead wasn't going to stop. Max stood beside him, his body tense, ears perked, ready. James knew his dog could sense the shift in the air, the danger that lingered just beyond those doors. The older guard kept his hand on his radio, shifting uncomfortably as the young one still hesitated, his baton shaking in his grip. The wounded officer groaned on the floor, trying to stop the bleeding on his wrist. Then the intercom crackled. "Call off the alarm." A voice, deep and commanding, echoed through the room. James froze. He knew that voice. Warden, Eric Donovan. James's stomach dropped. Of course. It all made sense now. Donovan had always been a man who played by his own rules. He had power, control, and a reputation for running this prison like a kingdom. No one questioned his authority. No one crossed him. And now, James understood why. Because Donovan had been part of this all along. The older guard swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the radio. "Sir, there's been an attempt on the prisoner's life. We need to—" "You need to do your job," Donovan's voice cut in sharply. "And that means keeping this quiet." Silence filled the room. James clenched his fists. He had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud sent rage burning through his veins. They had never intended to let him live. And now, they were trying to clean up their mess before it got out of control. The young guard shifted, looking between James and the intercom, torn between following orders and the truth unfolding in front of him. James took a slow, deep breath. He had a choice to make. Sit here and wait for the next attempt on his life, or fight back. He glanced down at Max. The German shepherd was staring at him, waiting for the next command, his body like a coiled spring, ready to strike. James made his decision. Without warning, he lunged.
The older guard barely had time to react before James knocked the radio from his grip. It clattered to the floor, the signal cutting off. "Stop him!" the young guard yelled. Too late. James grabbed the fallen guard's baton, swinging it with practiced precision. It cracked against the young officer's knee, sending him crumbling to the ground with a shout. Max moved in perfect sync, leaping at the injured officer still on the floor, pinning him before he could reach for his weapon again. James turned to the older guard, who had backed up against the wall, eyes wide. "You can either help me," James panted, his chest rising and falling rapidly, "or get out of the way." The guard hesitated. Then, jaw clenched, he reached into his pocket and tossed James a key. "For the cuffs," he muttered. James caught it, unlocking the chains around his wrists in one fluid motion. The weight of them hitting the floor sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was free. But he wasn't safe. Not yet. Because now there was only one way out of here, and that was through the warden himself. James didn't waste a second. He tossed the cuffs aside and grabbed Max's collar, steadying himself. His military instincts kicked in. Assess, adapt, act. He had been trapped in this prison for months, but now, for the first time, he had a real shot at survival. The older guard, the one who had given him the key, swallowed hard. "If you're gonna run, you need to do it now." James met his gaze. "I'm not running." The guard looked at him like he was insane. "Then what the hell are you doing?" James squared his shoulders. "Finishing this." The young guard on the ground groaned, gripping his injured knee. The officer Max had pinned was too dazed to fight back. For the moment, the room was under James's control, but he knew it wouldn't last. More guards would come. The warden wouldn't let this spiral any further. James took a deep breath. "Where is Donovan?" The older guard hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he muttered, "His office, top floor." James nodded. He had suspected as much. The warden would be sitting in his high tower, watching everything unfold. James turned to Max. "Heel." Max immediately moved into position at his side, eyes sharp, ears alert. The guard shook his head in disbelief. "You really think you can make it up there?" James gave a grim smile. "Watch me." Without another word, he pushed open the door and stepped into the hallway. Max followed without hesitation. The prison was eerily quiet. James kept a steady pace, moving through the corridors with Max at his side. He had memorized this place during his time here, the blind spots, the dead-end hallways, the places where security was weakest. But this wasn't a normal prison break. James wasn't just trying to escape. He was going straight into the lion's den. As he rounded the corner, 2 guards appeared at the end of the hall. Their eyes widened in shock when they saw him, unshackled, moving with purpose. One of them reached for his radio. "Prisoner!" James didn't let him finish. "Max, attack!" In a flash, Max sprang forward. The first guard barely had time to react before Max's powerful body slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. His radio skidded across the floor. James was already moving, charging at the second guard. He ducked under the man's swing and drove his elbow into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Max kept the first guard pinned as James grabbed the second one's baton and delivered a precise strike to his legs. The man collapsed. James exhaled, gripping the weapon tightly. He looked down at Max, who still had his jaws clenched around the first guard's arm. "Stand down." Max immediately released him, stepping back. His sharp eyes locked on James, waiting for the next move. James grabbed the fallen radio and pressed the button. He kept his voice calm, steady. "This is Callahan," he said, knowing the warden was listening. "I'm coming to you. You can try to stop me, or you can meet me like a man." Silence. Then, the intercom crackled again. "Brave of you, Callahan," the warden's voice drawled. "But you won't make it up here alive." James smirked. "We'll see about that." He dropped the radio and stepped over the unconscious guards. Max fell into formation beside him. The warden had tried to bury the truth, but now James was coming to dig it up. James moved swiftly, his heart pounding in sync with the rhythmic clicks of Max's paws against the cold prison floor. He had spent months trapped in this place, counting down the days to his execution. Now, he wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for the truth. With every step, he felt the weight of the injustice that had led him here. The betrayal, the lies, the trial that had never been fair. They had taken everything from him. His freedom, his honor, his future. But they had underestimated one thing. Max. And now, they were about to pay for it. As James approached the stairwell leading to the warden's office, more guards appeared at the top of the steps. Their weapons were drawn, their eyes filled with the kind of fear that only came when men knew they were on the wrong side of history. "Stand down, Callahan!" one of them shouted. James didn't stop. He raised his baton, jaw clenched. "Not a chance." The guards hesitated. They knew who he was, knew what he had done in the military, knew he was more than capable of taking them all down, but they had numbers. James had Max. The moment the first guard stepped forward, James gave the command. "Max, go!" The German shepherd launched himself up the stairs. The first guard screamed as Max crashed into him, jaws clamping down on his wrist before he could fire. The second tried to swing his baton, but James was already there. He ducked the attack and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him sprawling against the railing. His baton cracked against the steel bars, echoing through the stairwell. James didn't wait. He grabbed the fallen baton and swung it at the third guard, striking him across the arm before kicking his legs out from under him. Max released his grip and leaped to James's side, his teeth bared, growling low. The guards groaned, too injured to fight back. James stepped over them, breathing hard. One more level. The warden was waiting. And James was ready. The final hallway was silent. Too silent. James slowed his steps, Max pressing close against his leg. The warden's office was just ahead. The door was closed. The glass window behind it was tinted, making it impossible to see inside. James clenched his fists. He knew a trap when he saw one. He took a deep breath. Then, without hesitation, he kicked the door open. It swung violently, slamming against the wall. And there, behind the massive mahogany desk, sat Warden Donovan, calm, smirking, like he had been expecting him all along. Two armed guards flanked him, their fingers twitching over the triggers of their pistols. James didn't move. Neither did Max. The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that came before a storm. The warden leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the wood. "I have to say, Callahan, I admire your persistence." James kept his voice steady. "Cut the crap, Donovan. You tried to have me killed." The warden sighed dramatically. "I did try. And yet, here you are." His gaze flickered to Max. "You and your little mutt." James clenched his jaw. "You set me up." Donovan shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not." James took a step forward. The guards raised their weapons. Max let out a low growl, his body rigid. "You don't walk out of here," Donovan said smoothly. "You know that, right?" James's lips curled into a slow, humorless smile. "I think you're wrong." And then, before anyone could react, Max moved. In a flash, the German Shepherd lunged. Gunshots rang out. The room exploded into chaos. The gunfire erupted like thunder in the small office, the deafening sound bouncing off the walls. James moved on instinct, diving to the side as the guards fired. He hit the ground hard, rolling behind a chair for cover. Max was already in action. The German Shepherd had zeroed in on one of the guards before the man could aim again. With a vicious snarl, Max leapt, his powerful jaws clamping onto the man's arm. The guard screamed, his gun clattering to the floor. James seized the opportunity. He sprang up, grabbing the chair and hurling it at the second guard. It struck him square in the chest, knocking him backward. Before the man could recover, James lunged, delivering a brutal punch to his jaw. The guard crumpled. Max yanked the first guard down with one final tug, pinning him to the ground with his massive paws. The man groaned, trying to fight, but it was useless. James turned, his breath ragged, and locked eyes with Donovan. The warden was still seated behind his desk, but he wasn't smirking anymore. For the first time, James saw fear in his eyes, and it felt damn good. James stepped forward, kicking the fallen gun away from the unconscious guard. His muscles were tense, adrenaline still surging through his veins. "You lost," James said, his voice dark. Donovan scoffed, but James could see the sweat on his forehead. "What now?" the warden asked, forcing a laugh. "You gonna kill me?" James's grip on his baton tightened. He wanted to. For months, he had been locked away, waiting to bunt for a crime he didn't commit. This man had orchestrated it all, ruined his life, tried to silence him. And now, Donovan was the one sitting helpless, waiting to see what would happen next. But James wasn't a murderer. That was the difference between them. Instead, he took a slow step closer, his eyes locked onto the warden's. "I don't need to kill you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the guard's confiscated radio, the one he had swiped during the fight. James pressed the button. "This is James Callahan," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I have Warden Donovan in his office. He is armed. He is dangerous, and I am requesting immediate intervention from external law enforcement." A crackling silence. Then, a voice on the other end. "Copy that. Backup inbound." The warden paled. James smirked. "Now you're the one trapped." Max let out a small, satisfied growl, still holding his prisoner in place. James exhaled, finally, feeling like justice was coming. And this time, it was coming for the right man. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air, growing louder with every passing second. James stood tall, his chest rising and falling steadily as he watched the panic creep into Warden Donovan's eyes. For months, this man had controlled everything. The prison, the guards, even the corrupt legal system that had put James on death row. But now Donovan was the one with nowhere to run. Max remained at James's side, his body still tense, his dark eyes locked onto the warden like a predator watching its prey. Even without a command, he knew this wasn't over yet. A sharp knock on the office door made Donovan flinch. "Warden!" A muffled voice came from the other side. "Open the door. What's going on in there?" James didn't move. He just stared at Donovan, daring him to make a move. Slowly, the warden rose from his chair. With a shaky hand, he reached for the intercom on his desk. "This is Donovan," he said, his voice forced into its usual controlled tone. "Everything is under control. Stand down." James tilted his head. Wrong answer. Before Donovan could react, James grabbed the intercom mic from his hand and pressed the button himself. "This is James Callahan. The warden just tried to cover up an attempted assassination inside this prison. I am innocent. I was framed, and Donovan is at the center of it." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then, a new voice. One James didn't recognize. "This is FBI Special Agent Cole. We've been investigating this prison for months. Stay where you are, Callahan. Help is on the way." Donovan's face drained of color. James smiled. Checkmate. The next few minutes were chaos. The door burst open, and a flood of federal agents poured into the office. Max growled but held his ground, pressing his weight against the downed guard to ensure he wouldn't move. One agent stepped forward, gun raised, eyes scanning the room. "Where's the warden?" James smirked and pointed. "Right there." The agents moved fedid. Two of them yanked Donovan's arms behind his back, slamming him against his own desk as they cuffed him. "You can't do this," Donovan barked, struggling. "I own this place. This is my—" "Not anymore." The agent cut him off. "Eric Donovan, you're under arrest for conspiracy, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice." James watched as the once untouchable man was dragged out of his own office like a common criminal. It was over. He won. Hours later, James sat in an FBI interrogation room. This time, he wasn't the suspect. Across from him, Special Agent Cole leaned forward, hands folded. "Your name is officially cleared. The evidence we've gathered, plus your testimony, will make sure you walk out of here a free man." James exhaled slowly. Free. The word felt foreign. For so long, he had been trapped, waiting for a death that wasn't meant for him. And now, he was getting his life back. Cole glanced down at a file. "There's just one more thing," he said. "Your dog." James tensed. Max sat beside him, ears alert, waiting for his next command. Cole gave a small smile. We know Max was supposed to be transferred out when you were imprisoned, but he refused to work with any other handler. James looked down at Max. Max gazed up at him. No hesitation, no doubt, just unwavering loyalty. Cole closed the file. Max is yours, permanently. We've arranged everything. He goes home with you. James blinked. For the first time in a long time, a real, genuine smile crossed his face. He reached down, running his fingers through Max's fur. We're going home, buddy. Max's tail wagged. And just like that, for the first time since this nightmare began, James Callahan was truly free. Loyalty isn't just a word, it's an unbreakable bond. James lost everything, his freedom, his future, his hope. But in the end, it was Max who never gave up on him. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe, like, and share, because sometimes the greatest heroes walk on 4 legs.